And this may cover some of the material that you've already mentioned, but I just wanted to throw it in there because it's kind of a memorable concept, and it kind of sticks out when you read the paper. But you make mention fairly early on, and if I'm remembering this correctly, I think this is also a reference to Adrian Johnson's work, but to the notion of the rotten brain. So apologies if I'm asking you to retread certain material, but could you tell us a little bit about that concept and why it's a useful way of thinking?
Yeah, I stole the phrase from Johnston, who has a paper on rotten nature. And it's the sense of thinking, kind of as I've kind of been developing here, this idea of the brain. There are many, one might call them imaginary fantasies about the brain that we get in neuroscience, kind of like that study I mentioned at the beginning, seeing the image of the brain making you think that it's a more scientific paper. We think that, it's the turn in contemporary psychology that, the turn to neuroscience is on the one hand going to explain, it's going to give actual grounding to the psychological concepts and will let us decide between these different concepts. This is the actual proof, and so it's an elevation of neuroscientific objective explanation over subjective explanation. And I like the idea of the rotten brain because it's not a critique from the sense of, and this is a standard argument, and there's not without validity to it, but it's a standard argument that the material sciences have their uses, but they hit a certain limit when it comes to the human subject. The human science tradition, human subjectivity, that's sort of where the neurosciences would hit their limit. That you need a different type of framework, a different type of theorization to adequately address properties of proper human subjectivity, culture, subjectivity, phenomenology, and things like that. What I like about the notion of the rotten brain, and in a certain sense, that sort of bifurcation between a human science versus a natural science model, in a sense, it grants too much credit to the natural sciences, that it grants the material understanding of the brain sort of too much confidence that, okay, yeah, it's very confident up to this level, but beyond that, it can't move. Even up to that level, it has its own, short circuits. And it's, I use rotten to very, very viscerally get at the idea that this is not a very well-functioning organ. It's, like I said, what sort of evolution, what sort of thing must we have been given, which is itself in conflict with itself? What kind of bad evolutionary process must it be for us to have gotten something that is causing us excessive, suffering? There's the joke that God says, behold, I have created man, and then the angel says to him, no, you didn't. It's just a monkey with anxiety. What did you do? It's it's kind of getting rid of this, sense of the brain as a perfect unity and thinking about it as, it really needs, and of its own practices, pushes for concepts beyond natural sciences, which are nevertheless needed for the natural sciences to do and address the concepts that they're generating. And Slavoj Žižek gives this wonderful formula, and I think this sort of underlies my more what I was mentioning about my recent thinking on dual aspect monism in terms of how to think objective on the one hand and subjective on the other hand, is that he makes the argument that, with the increasing the preponderance of the brain sciences, I think he makes this in the parallax view, that on the one hand, you have the sort of standard rejection of the brain as, irrelevant. On the other hand, you'll have people saying kind of what you mentioned, that, oh, yes, finally, the psychoanalytic concepts are proved by brain concepts, and therefore now psychoanalysis is a science. Now we have the stamp of scientificity because, look, I can point at the brain and look, it lit up when I did this, and boom. I'm making a caricature, but these are kind of two arguments that come up, and he makes the wonderful argument that no, the proper way to go about the relationship between neuroscience and psychoanalysis is to look for pushing the neurosciences to their absolute limit, sort of the real of neuroscience in terms of the limits of their own symbolic economy and their own symbolic structures, which call for another real, the psychoanalytic real, which we need to meet. And it's this paradoxical meeting at the point of the real that is, in a way to think about how these disciplines can inform each other, not in this is the limit of my explanation and the limit of your explanation, that paradoxically the internal limit of my explanation calls for sort of the antagonism on your side of the table as well. And this is my thinking for the argument I made regarding Jaak Panksepp's instincts and the conflicting hyperpriors. To again cut the long story short, Mark Solms, in his argument for affective consciousness, he makes the case quite convincingly that you need this conflict of affective instincts, the conflict, say, between my need for safety, my need for attachment, my need for loving another object, caring for it, my need for excitatory exploration. These need to be in conflict in order for something like affective consciousness to emerge, insofar as what affective consciousness is purely affective arousal as an unexplained, non-representational sort of, he calls it a felt uncertainty. That when you have a deviation from one of these systems, there's an affective sense of uncertainty in the computational sense of uncertainty versus explanation, where the arousal of affective consciousness is the feeling of sort of chaos, uncertainty that then prompts the turn to representational neocortical structures that then explain and do the work of getting rid of it. So you need sort of an original sort of non-instinct. You can't have, in this sense of affective consciousness, if you have an instinct, and here I'm saying instinct with a capital I of, need, action, immediately gets rid of the need arousal, then boom, then in that sense, there's no consciousness because you have no arousal. If the consciousness is originating in the affect, then, and if, affective consciousness being the stand-in for, my salient, my sentient and salient being, then the core of subjectivity, say, of on the psychoanalytic side, the core of the extimate jouissance of the real that is paradoxically external to the ego, but nevertheless, as I'm arguing, central to the ego. This real, psychoanalytic real, emerges from the biological real of the conflicting hyperpowers, the real as the rottenness of the brain as inherently contradictory, itself generates something out of itself, but not in the sense of a totalized formation.
The generativity of the real. This is not really a question, actually, because just a comment, but it makes me wonder about Mark Solms' thinking. What would he make of the idea that some of his research is giving a kind of verification to certain Lacanian notions? In other words, that something like das Unbehagen, discord of a certain sort is fundamental to consciousness itself in some respect. But anyways, that's just a kind of whimsical comment. We should start to wrap up, but I just couldn't resist one last one. Said that a few minutes ago, never mind. What about death drive? What can you tell us about death drive in neuroscience? Does that concept have any affinity to something that you're able to point to? Does it have a usefulness? Is it an outmoded concept? What are your thoughts?
Sorry, I also can't resist just picking up on the Mark Solms comment. But one thing that he mentioned when I had presented some of this Lacanian neuropsychoanalytic work at the Neuropsychoanalysis Congress, and Mark, not a Lacanian, but one of the comments he made is that, and I think this illustrates the unique opportunity presented by neuropsychoanalysis is for different psychoanalytic schools to begin to be in dialogue with each other. That even just thinking the brain in Lacanian terms allowed other people to kind of understand some Lacanian concepts, not entirely, but to kind of understand it and also to have a different kind of intrigue towards it. So that's just to say, I think it's a very unique opportunity. There's all these arguments and, non-Lacanians sometimes really don't like the Lacanians because they seem very dogmatic, and the Lacanians don't like the non-Lacanians because they're not taking into account certain, that they're equally dogmatic and whatnot. I think in the best spirit, it can be a very useful, not agreement ground, but a meeting ground for rethinking concepts with the brain.
Yeah, very nice.
But just to comment on the death drive, I think, and again, I kind of lean into Adrian Johnston's interpretation here that, death drive for Freud, if you read Beyond the Pleasure Principle closely, it's not a very clear concept. He goes through many different sort of concepts that kind of get also a hodgepodgey way, kind of get pushed into death drive. It's aggression, it's repetition, it's the desire for total excitation in the sense of the nirvana principle. It's the, the drive toward death, as Freud calls it, the death drive. But I think that, so you can't just, death drive needs some type of refinement even from within Freud. That to think of it as a concept that isn't totally, missing one of the pieces that he attributes to it, then it needs to be sort of critically rethought. And I think that Slavoj Žižek does this work in terms of the notion of undead, the undead, the like vampires and things from horror stories and things like that, is kind of embodying the life of the death drive as this kind of undead life, as this monstrosity which is nevertheless alive, but is it's alien to us. Again, this alien excitation that breaks the barrier of the protective shield against stimuli that Freud talks about. And so, from the perspective of neuroscience, I think one of the key concepts that comes from that is the notion of repetition, where the way of procedural learning, and one of the concepts that is used from Marcus Holmes's work, is he has this notion of premature automatization, which is basically the idea that, again, you have all these different needs that conflict with each other as an infant, and there's nothing you can do to solve them perfectly. So you automatize solutions which do not work. You lay down in procedural, habitual memory solutions to the existential catastrophes of life which do not work, and they repeat in spite of their not working. And I think that dimension of repetition, coupled with again, to illustrate the usefulness of thinking these concepts in terms of the brain, Mark localizes that process to basal ganglia structures, the same structures that other people in terms of more the addictive literature localize in terms of the excitation index to the repetition of the motor action, which is separate from homeostasis. So then if you put those two together, because hey, it's the same brain structure, therefore these might be related, then the premature automatization of solutions which do not work paradoxically engender their own type of satisfaction, their own type of repetitive surplus that, despite the fact that it might be ruining the individual's interpersonal life, is nevertheless granting some type of jouissance, some type of paradoxical enjoyment. And again, I realize I'm reading the Lacanian concepts into the neuroscience, but I think that from the perspective of neuroscience, there isn't a concept of a drive toward death. There is no evidence for an innate drive which is seeking the self-destruction of the organism. But there are deathly phenomena in terms of the repetition of certain traces which are laid down. They do not work, but they're nevertheless laid down. And the repetition of those traces, all while giving its own enjoyment, can nevertheless lead to some quite deathly clinical phenomena in terms of the clinic of addictions and things like that. That's probably the clearest example, I think, where you can see this. And that's also to say that these, in this dimension, would be different from death drive in terms of Freud's, like civilization and discontents, thinking about it as an aggressive impulse. That these seem to be two different dimensions to it, but nevertheless, we can still think them as separate, but nevertheless interrelating with each other.
You'd mentioned Slavoj Žižek, and one of the contributions, he makes multiple different interjections in thinking death drive along Lacanian lines, but it seems kind of an elegant connection of sorts that some of the things that you mentioned in neuroscience seem to fit so well. So, two of the themes, at least, that came up. One, we've already mentioned it, this insistent repetition of certain functionings, and then also this arousal beyond self-preservation. And if you carefully track all of the ways, another one maybe fits slightly less well, or no, in fact, probably does fit fairly well in terms of what you've said, is a kind of ontological incompletion. And at least in my reading of Žižek's understandings of death drive, those three things seem to be constantly interwoven in how he wants to think about the Lacanian stroke Freudian death drive, and what you've just said seems to fit with those, particularly this idea of, there's a repetition that doesn't stop, that has some kind of arousal, and that arousal is maintained, and there's certain forms of gratification that are served beyond the organism's self-preservative or its own best interests. So yeah, that's great. But also just the point, I suppose, that you'd also made, that in terms of what Pagsep says about affective instincts, death is not one of them. There's others, but yeah, I think that's useful. Maybe just to sign off then, John, anything, where are you looking to focus on now? Where is your future work aimed at? Are you able to give us a little sketch, if you're able?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think I've mentioned some of it already. One of the things I'm working on right now is thinking a dual aspect monism and dynamic localization in terms of not only the positive, in terms of a positive correlation between, concept A, concept B, but also thinking in terms of sort of taking the reference I made from Zizek in terms of, the neuronal real and the psychoanalytic real, trying to think that into dynamic localization and dual aspect monism as, it's a step toward thinking not of, the thing that's out there in nature that I have two independent perspectives of, but that thing itself cannot be thought of as sort of a simply existent thing. That thing is wrecked and wrought with a type of antagonism or incompleteness, out of which is generated two divergent and irreconcilable perspectives. No matter how much neuroscientific research is done, we will never, or at least to the best of people's understanding now, they'll never really be able to unify my subjective sense of myself with my physical body, that there's going to be a minimal difference always, a minimal separation between my subjective sense of myself and my brain. Even if I can look at my brain while I'm speaking, I can't fully unify them together and without any type of contradiction. So that I think that type of thinking calls for a rethinking of dual aspect monism. That's one of the places that my current work is going in. At the same time, I think may have mentioned or may not have, but I have 3 papers which are coming out in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association on sex and prediction error, which is taking up a computational neuroscience, and Carl Friston, who is sort of he's probably one of the most influential neuroscientists ever. He designed the system which is used for fMRI brain imaging processing, and is currently using the free energy principle, Bayesian brain theory. But there's thinking about that in terms of jouissance and trying to think about antagonism, even at the level of so-called a principle, which is going to, his argument is that the overall principle of every part of the brain is to, in some sense, reduce prediction error, reduce, sort of explain away unexplained inputs, essentially. In terms of my thinking of that along the lines of jouissance, again, from this notion of the impossibility of this total explanation, not due to the complexities of the external world, but really due to the innate structure of the predictive system itself. And going from that sort of connection to trying to think of a Lacanian neuropsychoanalytic theory of the subject. The subject, in all its complexities, as argued by Lacan, the subject is split. It is, an effect of the interplay of language, but the subject is also indexed to the real, and how to think of the subject. And I realize it's maybe an ambitious project, but to think about a truly Lacanian neuropsychoanalytic theory of how to conceptualize the subject in terms of neuronal functioning. And in the process of doing that, that also entails sort of a rethinking of the symbolic as well. And in terms of the less theoretical, more research aspects of it as well, using sort of Lacanian studies in aphasia, which, as I mentioned, Lacan himself references when he introduces metaphor and metonymy. So I think I can say that he did it, so why can't I? But using that as a method for investigating language in its different dimensions as it relates to subjectivity, simultaneously in relation to the brain as well.
Thank you so much, John. I mean, maybe just a couple of thoughts just by way of closing. I mean, the project of a book thinking the Lacanian subject through neuroscience would be incredible, really, because I think there's so many Lacanian concepts which are a little bit elusive or opaque or slippery or difficult to grasp. And the subject certainly is one. Subject as itself, an instantiation of a discordance, of a non-commensurability, as a kind of split, subjectified. It's a tricky concept to get to grips with. But in fact, a lot of what you've said today suggests that there's neuroscience is kind of closing in a way on that kind of theory of the subject. So I would love to hear more about that. The other thought I had, which relates to something you said far earlier on, is that, sometimes a kind of historicizing narrative of how Lacan has been taken up in the English-speaking world does the thing of saying, well, there was the Lacan who's spoken about and taught in English departments. Then there was, kind of, maybe with the work of Bruce Fink, we see a kind of attempt to think, to utilize psychoanalytic Lacan clinically. I suppose some people would say that's the most appropriate version. Then there's Lacanian social theory. And it started to make me wonder whether the Lacan of the future, in the English-speaking world at least, will be one who informs or is in dialogue with Lacanian neuroscience, which is an intriguing possibility. And then just the last thought to share with you is, and in fact, John and I had joked a little bit about this at the beginning, it seems to me such a nice title for how you've been able to present ideas, is to think that one title for this discussion might be everything you always wanted to know about neuroscience, but were too afraid to ask Lacan, or John for that matter. So John, thanks again for your time and your generosity and all your input. And I know I am certainly looking forward to more publications, and I'm certainly also hoping we can have you back to ask some more questions.
Absolutely, it'd be a pleasure. And thank you very much, Derek.